Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian Institution. My name is Modupe Labode, and I am a curator in the divisions of political and military history and cultural and community life, and I specialize in African American social justice history. Today, I'm filling in as the moderator. Dr. Anthea Hartig, the museum's director, was to moderate today, but unfortunately she's been called away due to a death in her family. We're thinking of her and her loved ones during this very difficult time. It is my privilege to be your host in the museum's first Black Philanthropy Month program. And today we are focusing on the stories that objects in our museum can tell us about Black philanthropy. We're so pleased to welcome attendees from across the nation. I would like to recognize a few special guests in attendance, including Steve Case, the chair of the Smithsonian Institution's Board of Regents, and Kevin Gover, the undersecretary of the Museum for Museums and Culture at the Smithsonian. I am in the greater Washington, D.C. area, and we acknowledge the precedents of the Piscataway, Pamunkey, and Nascatine nations and their descendants. The Chesapeake Bay region is home to indigenous people from throughout the hemisphere. Wherever we are, let us acknowledge and give our respect and gratitude to the native peoples in our area for the opportunity to work and live in their territories. In this program, we will speak with curators and research interns involved with the museum's new History of African American Fundraising Collecting Initiative. We'll also be able to go behind the scenes to see objects of Black philanthropy in our collection that have been identified by our summer interns. We will then have time to take your questions, so please feel free to submit those at any time through the Q&A feature in the lower part of your screen. This program is made possible through the generous support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, David M. Rubenstein, and the Fidelity Charitable Trustees Initiative, a grant-making initiative program of Fidelity Charitable. 3 curators are involved in the launching of the History of African American Fundraising Collecting Initiative. Dr. Amanda B. Moniz, the museum's David B. M. Rubenstein Curator of Philanthropy, Dr. Crystal Moten, Curator of African American History, and myself. So, hello, everyone.
Hello.
So, Amanda, let's start with you. As the museum's philanthropy curator, I wonder if you can give us some context by describing the philanthropy initiative and the work you are doing to build the National Philanthropy Collection.
I'd be happy to. The philanthropy initiative consists of several components: a long-term exhibition called Giving in America, the history of philanthropy as a collecting area for the museum, the curatorial post, an annual symposium called The Power of Giving, Philanthropy's Impact on American Life, and a robust digital presence. The exhibition Giving in America explores the experiences and impact of givers from everyday philanthropists to prominent benefactors throughout our history. The Power of Giving Symposium is the cornerstone of our work, convening important conversations, examining how Americans' gifts of time, expertise, and resources have shaped the world and continue to do so. Philanthropy was added as a collecting area in 2015. Previously, the history of philanthropy hadn't been a dedicated collecting area, though as we'll be exploring in this program, there are philanthropy stories in our existing holdings just waiting to be told and retold. As I started building the new National Philanthropy Collection, I've been focused on acquiring objects that tell stories of the diversity of American cultures and practices of giving, and also that tell stories about the work of philanthropic fundraising. I was thrilled to be able to collect a pair of pancaked ballet shoes worn by Misty Copeland, generously donated by American Ballet Theater. You may be wondering what pancaking means. When dancers of any background dance without tights, they color their shoes using makeup to match their complexion. The pancaked shoes worn by Misty Copeland helped tell her inspiring story as the first African-American principal dancer in the prestigious American Ballet Theater. And perhaps less obviously, they also tell layers of stories about Black philanthropy. African-American donors are particularly interested in giving to cultural institutions such as ballet companies that are meaningfully diverse and inclusive, and the shoes help explore that history. Perhaps most movingly, the shoes help tell the story of Misty Copeland's own philanthropy. She's given her time mentoring young dancers of colors at Boys and Girls Clubs, the kind of clubs where she learned to dance. And during the pandemic, she helped lead fundraising to support dancers during a time when they couldn't perform or earn a paycheck. The shoes help us to recognize her role in a long and ongoing history of Black women and Black men giving to support their communities and advance social justice.
Those shoes are really beautiful. We're here to mark Black Philanthropy Month in August, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the origins of Black Philanthropy Month.
Absolutely. Black Philanthropy Month began 10 years ago when Dr. Jacqueline Bouvier Copeland and the Pan-African Women's Philanthropy Network launched this special month to celebrate and lift up giving by people of African descent, choosing August because of its historical significance in Black history. Beleda Fullwood and Tracy Webb, who are both leaders in raising appreciation of Black giving, joined the effort a couple of years later. And over the past decade, the recognition of August as Black Philanthropy Month has grown in scope and scale, and it's really reshaping our understanding of American philanthropy as we better appreciate it through an African-American lens. At the National Museum of American History, we're thrilled to be marking the 10th anniversary of Black Philanthropy Month with this program. We're honored that Dr. Copeland is a member of our Philanthropy Initiatives Working Group, and we're thrilled that Beleda Fullwood is with us today.
Oh, that's really wonderful. So why don't we turn now to look at the kind of the nuts and the bolts of the collecting initiative. So Crystal, when people hear that we're looking at fundraisers or the fundraising collecting, that might not be really clear to some people what we're actually talking about. We're talking about the people who raise resources. And in Black history, there has been a long history of making a way out of no way, that Black people and they're organizing and strategizing when they're building institutions like schools and hospitals, when raising funds for scholarships, bailing people out in the civil rights movement. That all takes some money, and that Black people have been involved in fundraising for those causes. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the scholarship, the new scholarship that's emerging that shows us how Black philanthropy has changed how we look at these activities.
Yes, thank you so much for that great question, Modupe. There is exciting new scholarship related to Black philanthropy, including that of the 2 research fellows who we are collaborating with on the collecting initiative, including Dr. Tanisha Ford and Dr. Tyrone Freeman. Dr. Tanisha Ford is a professor in the history department at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, and she's currently working on an extensive biography of Harlem socialite Molly Moon, who through her fundraising efforts helped to fund aspects of the civil rights movement. Also, Dr. Tyrone Freeman, who is a professor of philanthropic studies and the director of undergraduate programs at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, recently wrote a fabulous biography on Madam C.J. Walker entitled Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, Black Women's Philanthropy During Jim Crow. This book is a critical examination of the famous entrepreneur's philosophy and practices as they related to giving and community development. Now, taken together, the research of our 2 fellows allows us to expand the possibilities of exploring Black organizing and activism, thinking about these activities in new ways, especially when we consider Dr. Freeman's definition of African-American philanthropy, which he defines as a medley of beneficent acts and gifts that address someone's needs or larger social purposes that arise from a collective consciousness and shared experience of humanity. This definition opens space for everyday people's activism and organizing actions to be interpreted and connected to forms of giving and philanthropy. Beneficent acts and gifts can include monetary donations, but could also include creating jobs, as Madam C.J. Walker did through her company, or planning and coordinating fashion shows, as Molly Moon did as a Harlem socialite. Both of these actions, different though they were, had a similar end goal: improving the material and lived conditions of Black folks and moving the community toward freedom and liberation.
That's a really great explanation. And I really encourage anyone who's interested to look up Dr. Ford and Dr. Freeman. Their writing is really accessible and it'll kind of change the way you think about some things.
Definitely.
So I wondered, we mentioned already that our summer research interns are going to be looking at the collection. They've been looking at the collection. Could you just explain, Crystal, why assessing the collection is so important in the work of this initiative?
Yes. So to extend the stories we're telling, we need to start by knowing what we already have in our collections. And so all objects speak with multiple voices. And by re-examining our collections through the lenses of both African-American history and philanthropy, and the new research by Dr. Freeman and Dr. Ford, we're able to tell both more stories and more complex stories. And when we start to collect new objects, we'll be able to do so more meaningfully. We've been so fortunate that in the face of pandemic restrictions, we've been able to have 2 research interns who've been working virtually on helping us assess the collections. And this is, again, the first critical step in the History of African American Fundraising Collective Initiative. Since I just mentioned that we've been so fortunate to have our wonderful research interns, I would like to briefly introduce them. So Acoma Gaither and Sylvia Marshall are our 2 research interns. And Acoma Gaither is a recent graduate of the Heritage Studies and Public History Master's Program at the University of Minnesota. In Minnesota, she's worked on several projects at the Minnesota Historical Society, including a traveling exhibit, the history of race and policing in Minnesota, and then also a restorative justice panel series. During the spring of 2021, she was a Protest and Preservations Collections Care Fellow with the Midwest Art Conservation Center and the George Floyd Global Memorial. Her research interests include 20th century mutual aid networks in the Midwest, Black geographies, and protest sign conservation. After her internship concludes at the museum, she will start as the new public programs manager at the Hennepin History Museum in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we're very excited about that. Sylvia Marshall is a native of Columbus, Georgia, and is currently pursuing a master's degree in history with a public history concentration, and this is being done at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Her areas of interest include African American history and culture in the South, the Civil Rights Movement, cultural institutions, public history, and food history. In addition to collaborating with us with our fundraising collective initiative, she has also been working with the American Food History team this summer. I'm so happy to welcome Acoma and Sylvia to the program.
Well, we have been really so privileged to have them here, and interns do not only a tremendous amount of work, but they also contribute to the intellectual understanding of our collections. So we're really fortunate to have a short film that will take you behind the scenes to show you some of the collections that Sylvia and Acoma identified during the past few weeks that illustrate what we mean when we're talking about Black philanthropy.
Thank you so much, both Crystal and Modupe. Like Modupe just mentioned, we will be sharing objects related to Black American philanthropy that we found in the National Museum of American History's collections. This work has definitely allowed me to dive deeper into the understanding of how giving is traditionally passed on within the Black community and how this idea can be grounded in collective care and responsibilities for one another as we push towards liberation. And I know the direction that I put into this is, rather than searching for stories of folks strictly giving monetarily to causes, we wanted to focus on stories rooted in this interrelationship between Black people giving time, talent, and resources, and civic and community leadership and organized philanthropy.
Thank you, Acoma. In this video you're about to see, we share 4 objects identified through our research in the museum's collections and archives. This expands upon our definition of notions of the word philanthropy and reveals the element of activism within a tradition of African-American giving. Objects of African-American philanthropy show us the multitude of ways they attempted to improve their lives of those in their community in the face of second-class citizenship.
So let's go into the collections and see this film. So we're going to go behind the scenes here.
We will now introduce in chronological order some of the objects that we identified through the History of African American Fundraising Collecting Initiative. This is a face vessel from the Edgefield district of South Carolina, which had one of the largest production sites of Black pottery in the United States. This type of pottery was produced beginning in the 1850s in the western region of South Carolina. There were many production sites in this area during the 19th century in which enslaved Africans worked and produced much of the vessels. Many were trained to produce these popular utilitarian, mass popular stoneware vessels. And a lot of the enslaved Africans who worked there lived in different parts of what was the time the Kingdom of Congo. When I first looked at this jug, I saw the face, but as I spent more time observing, I began to uncover the features of the face to learn more about the application. And I started to notice that this was really done with an expert eye. The vessel that existed underneath that face really showed a high degree of technical skill. If you notice the spout at the top of the vessel, you can see that this was actually thrown onto a pottery wheel, and this would have allowed for the uniformity at the opening. Somewhat in contrast to that are the facial features that we can assume were applied by hand. After the jug was cut from the wheel, it looks as if the artist's hands crafted the circles around the eyes and the forming of the nose and mouth. You can also notice that the way that the mouth is shaped, that it seems to give an expression. The overall surface is a dark brown color with this olive green coating over it. Within the eyes, we can see a patch of white that seems to break through as if the surface material on top was worn away over time. Most of the vessel is covered with this clear gaze and it's shiny, however, the eyes are not. And the use of kaolin to make the eyes of the Edgefield vessel's white eyes relates to the ancient northern Congo practice of inserting porcelain fragments in the eye sockets in carved human figures, which is well known to Central African figural carvings. And the use of this white material is in context reflected the spiritual possession of this said object. I really see this object as a form of philanthropy because of the spiritual knowledge that was passed down generation after generation. These vessels also illustrated traditional links between African and African American cultures, as well as modes of collective care. It provided spiritual strength for freedom seekers. And resistance is also a characteristic in this object. Many African Americans found social activity to fit into this larger pattern of resistance, and it provided a degree of control over their lives. However, strategies of resistance were not simply about breaking the bonds of white oppression. It also kept alive modes of cultural activity, secret communication, and spiritual belief that otherwise would not have survived.
This carte de visite reflects the points that Acoma made about collective care within African American philanthropy and how philanthropy can be an act of resistance. While researching the term abolitionist in the collection system, this photograph of Harriet Hayden grabbed my attention, and the description intrigued me further. This carte de visite is a part of a untitled photograph album created circa 1864. People kept albums like this one, kind of like a autograph album or like a collection of baseball cards of people that they admired. This one was devoted to anti-slavery. In the photograph, you see a well-dressed African-American woman with a description underneath her that states that this is Mrs. Hayden and that she escaped from slavery. Harriet Hayden and her husband, Lewis Hayden, were prominent anti-slavery activists and conductors in the Underground Railroad in Boston, Massachusetts. They escaped slavery with the help of Methodist minister Calvin Fairbanks in 1844. Fairbanks was arrested for his role in their escape, but by 1849, Lewis and Harriet had raised enough money to pay the former enslaver to pardon Fairbanks. The Haydens operated a boarding house that served as a stop on the Underground Railroad. The couple provided food, shelter, and money to ferry fugitives further north. The philanthropy of the Haydens extended beyond the work as conductors on the Underground Railroad. The couple helped fund John Brown's raid on the Harper's Ferry in 1859. Lewis Hayden died in 1889, and when Harriet Hayden died in 1893, she left the bulk of their estate, roughly $5,000, to Harvard Medical School to establish a scholarship for African-American students. The Lewis and Harriet Hayden Scholarship for Colored Students continued to carry on the philanthropic legacy of the Haydens. And as of 2015, the Hayden Scholarship is still offered to students at Harvard Medical School. I love the story behind this photograph of Harriet Hayden because it shows how philanthropy acted as a tool of liberation. Their actions also demonstrated the power of free Black communities in the North and their contributions to the abolition movement. As formerly enslaved persons, the Haydens knew very well the horrors of slavery firsthand. When the Haydens opened their home as a refuge in the Underground Railroad and contributed their time and resources, they used their philanthropy to push for the freedom of other African Americans. The philanthropy of Harriet and Lewis Hayden challenged a system that denied African Americans the right to live as free citizens of the United States.
This next object is a fireman's badge from the Niagara Fire Company, number 8, from Charleston, South Carolina, from the year 1861. This badge is considered a metal thumbnail badge, which is in a shield shape. It's quite small, as you can see. It's about the size of an adult human thumb. The front of it has an engraved 5-point star at the top, with the inscription below, and at the bottom are the initials WPP. Niagara Fire Company was one of a handful of African-American volunteer fire companies created at the onset of the Civil War in Charleston, South Carolina, and later incorporated during Reconstruction. Niagara was also the first independently operated fire company. The WPP initials stand for William P. Perry, who was a freed man in Charleston. He was also a bricklayer and a volunteer with the company, and he would also later become one of its leaders. The badge expands both the representation of African-American participation in firefighting, which was an opportunity denied for much of the country's history, as well as that of firefighting in the South, which is rare in the material record. One of the earliest known rosters for the company, which was written in 1866, notes Perry as a 21-year-old. It's also quite possible that he joined the company when it first opened and was official in 1861, which would have made him 17 at the time. But that's not really surprising because that wouldn't be far from the other ages of the other people who enlisted who were under 20 years old. Can you imagine what that must have been like to be a youth helping save structures and buildings within your own community during that time? The badge connects to the story of African-American participation, both in Charleston and the United States, from the colonial period throughout the early 19th century. You know, if you think about it in historical terms, a lot of African Americans, whether they were free or enslaved, might have joined a bucket line or otherwise cooperated in communal efforts to put out fires. And a lot of enslaved folks were often expected to salvage goods from properties that were in danger. However, far more often, the white population, which were increasingly actually the minority in the 1800s onwards, viewed the African-American community as potential arsonists rather than partners in community protection. And nearly every major fire in the 18th and 19th centuries were attributed to Black incendiaries. This is just another example of the ways that care takes place within the community and how folks volunteered to help put out fires within the Charleston community. And it's a unique form of philanthropy because, you know, firefighters, they risk their day or their lives every day and showed this altruistic heroism within their work.
The Bridgewater collection contains documents that display the rich history of the African-American Bridgewater family, who migrated from the American South to Montana in the early 20th century. The papers contain material on the social, economic, and political life of African-Americans in the West. I kept finding material from the Montana Federation of Negro Women's Clubs, such as this cookbook that you see here. Octavia Bridgewater, one of the architects behind the family collection, was a prominent figure within this organization. In the Montana Federation of Negro Women's Clubs, both Black and white women's clubs used community cookbooks to raise money for their philanthropic projects. The organization gathered recipes from its members and published them in this bound book that you see here to be sold for 50 cents around Montana. The cookbook demonstrates this idea of African-American philanthropy as a form of collective care within the Black community. African-American women formed philanthropic groups like the Montana Federation of Negro Women's Clubs to fill the social, political, and economic gaps left by racial discrimination and an unequal treatment Black Americans face in American society. The money collected from the sale of this cookbook helped the club support the Claudia Bivens Scholarship Fund to help Black high school students attend college, civil rights legislation, and a variety of other programs to improve race relations in the state. The cookbook also reveals a less obvious form of philanthropy. Throughout the book, each recipe has its contributor listed next to it. Octavia Bridgewater herself contributed several of her recipes to this cookbook. This is vitally important, especially during this period where several cookbooks were written by white authors who included recipes they learned from African-American cooks. However, many of these women did not receive credit, nor did they receive compensation for their contributions. A cookbook such as this one that was written by African-American women and that gives credit to their culinary knowledge becomes a part of this larger conversation about African-American philanthropy as a response to exclusion. In fact, in the act of fundraising to combat the political and economic effects of racial segregation, the Montana Federation of Negro Women's Clubs gave the Black women in their organization a voice. Black culinary literature, like this cookbook, functioned as a material form of resistance and as a way of self-definition. When Acoma and I first started this internship, we kept asking ourselves whether the objects we were finding actually fell under the definition of African-American philanthropy. Throughout the summer, we were challenged to expand our understanding of what giving entailed within the African-American community and to adopt a more encompassing definition. Objects of African-American philanthropy are important because they show us the centrality of collective care and community responsibility within the history of African-American giving. They reveal to us the multitude of ways African Americans attempted to improve the lives of those in their community in the face of second-class citizenship.
Thank you so much, Sylvia and Acoma. Your work is really enlightening and eye-opening. And as I was listening, I was really just struck by how much these objects are deeply personal, but also communal. And I think this might be some of the ways in which it has kind of a resonance with us. And I just should let everyone in the audience know that Acoma and Sylvia had an extremely long list of potential objects that they wanted to share. And it was through a lot of kind of discernment and very difficult process of whittling it down to 4. But they will also be creating Learning Lab, which is a wonderful Smithsonian resource where you can learn much more about it. So thank you again. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, curators Amanda Moniz and Crystal Moten, and the research fellows, Dr. Tanisha Ford and Dr. Tyrone Freeman, for their continued work through the History of African American Fundraising Collective Initiative. Now, we are delighted to turn to questions that have been coming in. So please feel free to ask your questions. We've got a fair amount of time to have a conversation here. So I'm going to start with the first one. So this is from Sonia Michelle, and I'll just read it out for everyone. As I'm sure you're all aware, philanthropies not only raise resources, but they also distribute them according to various criteria. I wonder if anything in the collection sheds light on this aspect of philanthropic activity and how recipients of charity responded. Also, a more theoretical question, what do you all think about the dynamic between philanthropy and government-sponsored and operated social services, such as welfare, food stamps, Medicaid, et cetera? Thanks, and this is a fascinating panel. So I think what I will try to do, because I know that Dr. Moten's research deals with women's activism in the late 20th century. So I wondered if you, Dr. Moten, if you could take the last part of the question about the dynamic between philanthropy and government-operated social services.
I sure can. Thank you so much for that. That interesting and thought-provoking question. And the main thing that comes to mind as I think about the sometimes fraught dynamic between philanthropy and government-sponsored and operated social services is that many times, especially philanthropy or philanthropic efforts that are coming out of Black communities are responding to the structural and racial injustice in actually accessing those government-sponsored social services, because throughout the history of this country, although supposedly social services, were race neutral, they actually were doled out in very racially exclusive ways. And so many times you see Black communities responding to the inability to access social services. And I think thinking about the Montana Club women and Black women's organizations like that over the course, especially of the 20th century, we see how Black women in their organizations have stepped in to fill the gaps in their communities when Black folks have not been able to access those government sponsored programs and resources.
And I think you bring up this really important point that although things might appear race neutral in the records, that's where you really need to understand the context and listen to people, what's going on. So Sylvia or Acoma, I'm wondering if you saw anything in your research about how people responded to this charitable activity. So Sylvia, why don't I start with you?
Sure. So I'm thinking about the Harriet Hayden piece, thinking about the community and the fact that along with being conductors on the Underground Railroad, they were a part of some pretty prominent cases of fugitive slaves being collected by slave catchers illegally, and actually Lewis Hayden actually went to one of the courthouses in Boston and broke out one of these fugitive slaves. And so when you think about the response of the community, he was part of several committees who they paid him for his services, and he then distributed that money outward. And so in terms of the community response is very positive. You're talking about people that fought for the freedom of their community and for others. And so when you think of the community response to this, and going back to the question of philanthropic causes or philanthropists being not as just raising money and giving resources, they gave more than money, or they raised more than money. They raised a community, which is just as important as, the raising of funds and the giving of clothes that they did in Boston.
That's a really great, and I think the idea of, it's kind of hard to get your mind around that, that being a fugitive slave was somebody, you were property that could be reclaimed. So kind of doing that action was illegal. Acoma, did you have any response to that, our first question about how people, the recipients looked at the philanthropy?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the space vessels that I talked about in the video. I see these space vessels or jugs as philanthropic actors within those who were enslaved. Like I mentioned before in the historical record, there are instances of those who had were runaways who had gone to the north in seek of freedom, carrying these space vessels. So this was very important. And you can notice this syncretic relationship between African traditions being brought over across the Atlantic into this new world over here. And you notice that these held a lot of spiritual significance to those who were carrying them in search of freedom, in search of new jobs. This was a very, it provided a lot of spiritual aid, which I don't think might not be talked a lot about in philanthropy, but I think this is so, so important when you talk about Black philanthropy in this case. I also study a lot of mutual aid societies, and when doing my research, I was looking at a lot of free African societies in the colonial period in the late 1700s. And one example that I really thought of was with Richard Allen and Absalom, who they were both clergymen who were working in Philadelphia, who created the Free African Society, who were, giving resources, giving just a lot to the ecosystem within the Black community. They provided education, literacy, a lot of these, aid sources to the community. And they also helped folks, Black, white, anyone throughout. There was a 1793 Philadelphia fever epidemic, and they were providing a lot of the aid when a lot of folks were fleeing the city as well. And a lot of folks noticed this. A lot of the press noticed it and highlighted it. So yeah, I'm pretty sure a lot of folks were grateful within their efforts, and they definitely contributed to the ecosystem, the philanthropic ecosystem, and their places and sites.
One of the things that you mentioned with the yellow fever epidemic in this, as we're enduring this ongoing pandemic, I did read a lot in some sites like the African American Intellectual History Society about the connection between Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, all the people, many, many women also who were nursing yellow fever victims, and the mutual aid groups that have been established in communities throughout the country. So what you're talking about is the mutual aid, and the connection is extraordinarily important, and about how we rethink philanthropy. Also, we've got I'll just note is that there is a lot of love for the Haydens in the chat. People want to know more about the Haydens, and I would encourage you to, there's a little bit on the Boston Athenaeum website, and maybe Sylvia, if you've seen other things, you can put some information in the chat, because I think people are very excited about the Haydens. We have a question here about the face jugs. And so said, I love this presentation. I really connected to the first piece of pottery. Are there any theories about what the jug was used for in its time? It seems too beautiful and delicate to be used as just a jug. Was it home decoration, or maybe a coveted community object, like a nice painting? Acoma, what have you found in your research?
Yeah, that's a very great question. I see a lot of these potteries and vessels as in the domestic kind of realm. However, I think what's really important when looking at these specific face vessels, because they're different from a lot of the pottery that was produced from the Edgefield district in South Carolina, was that these held I would say a very religious and spiritual significance over those who created them and those who also held them as well. If you look specifically at the details on the face vessels, you can tell, like within the eyes, they were made out of kaolin, which was very prominent in West Africa. And this really reflected a lot of spiritual possession within the face vessels, and kind of this flash of the spirit. So I think they were more towards ritualistic and spiritual kind of purposes for those who held them. A lot of them, in my research, I read that a lot of the ancestors, they believed that ancestors, they were carried through water. So these actually held, their purpose was to hold water. And, you know, you had a part of your ancestors within them. So that's how I read it. I read it more spiritually centered, and for the ancestors.
And one thing I'll just note is that many of the scholars that we've been reading as we've been going through this really talk about a lot of continuity between the African continent, the African diaspora, and Black life in North America. So the idea of power, of centering self-help, and the aid that you see in Islam and in many indigenous religions, talking about that, I think in the Tyrone Freeman, in the introduction to his book about Madam Walker, lets us know that we need to pay attention to those deep connections with the past. So we have a question here from Chad Huber. And I think said, so how and where was the fire badge from the Niagara Company found? Such a small object with an important story. So I think, did both of you talk to Tim Winkle, the curator? Okay.
We did.
So Sylvia, why don't you start with looking about because it's a fascinating story.
It is a fascinating story. And so we met with Timothy Winkle, one of the curators here, to discuss some objects of philanthropy that he might have in his collection. He collects around firefighting, some police objects, and also fraternal organizations. And so as we were talking, he brought up this newly acquired object, the firefighter badge. And he obtained it from a person who was doing metal detecting around the area. And when he dug up the object and looked at it, he was like, this looks very interesting, and started doing a bit more research on it. And so that's how Timothy Winkle was then contacted about the object. Acoma, if you want to.
Yeah, it was found at a site that was actually going to put up new infrastructure. There was a local metal detector man who loved to look for old objects in the Charleston area. So this was actually found in 2020, I believe. But what's so important about this object is that just, of course, the bravery, right? During this time that the badge was actually commissioned, which was 1861, in the record, there was about 10 white firefighter companies and actually 10 Black firefighting companies, all which had white presidents. But what made the Niagara Company so special was that they didn't have a white president. It was all Black led, and white firefighters actually received about $16 an hour while they engaged in firefighting, and Black companies, you know, that they were forced to work for free. However, there were only incentive payouts given to company members that arrived first at the scene. So you know that they're doing this at a high risk, right? And I just feel like A lot of their efforts were kind of pushed under the rug in the press. You don't see a lot of coverage about them until the later 1860s and early 1870s. But of course, they struggled a lot. But also within the material record, in the press specifically, you see them putting on parades, fairs, soirees to raise funding to get engines so they could actually go out and fight the fires that were happening in Charleston. And if you look at Charleston's history in 1861, there was a huge fire, and there was a lot of Black company members that actually went out to go fight for that too. And they're not getting paid for it. They're doing this because, you know, they're fighting, you know, for their communities as well, even though they were slandered in the press as well for, you know, maybe starting fires and whatnot. So this is a very important story. That's not a lot in the material record as well.
Thank you so much for both of you for your answer. And I just want to recognize that Dr. Tanisha Ford is with us today. So I hope your ears have been burning because I think sometimes historians, well, scholars write books and articles and they think like, who's reading this? I will assure you that people are reading and thinking about Black philanthropy. So we have a question from a colleague here and it said from Tony Perry, I'm really looking forward to the learning lab based on this work. I wonder if Sylvia and Acoma could tell us about an object they found interesting but didn't make it into the presentation. Great program. Okay, Sylvia, why don't you start first about what was on your the next object that you wanted to put up there?
Ooh, that's a great question. So in terms of the next object, I also interned with the American Food History Project. And so while working on some web labels for them, I came across this Food Warriors t-shirt by the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. And it's a organization founded to ensure that Detroit's African American community participated in this growing urban food movement and urban gardening, and to put the reins of leadership into the community itself. And so as I was researching the organization, I'm like, wow, this is great, this is amazing. And I started to think about it in terms of philanthropy. And so this was around the time that Acoma and I were broadening our definition of what philanthropy was, because we were kind of pigeonholing ourselves thinking, okay, what is philanthropy? Is it more than money? And so as I was learning more about this organization, I began to see philanthropy as the giving back to the community in terms of leadership, time, and resources, like we've been talking about during this program. This organization, you know, saw a problem in that people outside from Detroit were coming into the community and trying to lead these food movements, oftentimes younger white activists that didn't really understand, you know, the situation of Detroit. There's a lot of great activism going on, grassroots activism within the community, and they saw that gap and they decided, let's listen to the voice of the community and let's create something that'll, you know, benefit them in the long run in terms of food insecurity, and also in terms of raising the voices of community leaders, which sometimes their voices can get buried. And so I thought that, you know, this t-shirt represented philanthropy and how it can be tangible and intangible. And so that's something that did not make the cut. It's in the learning lab, but it did not make the cut into this video. I really identified with the cookbook and the Harriet Hayden album just as much. And I thought that they would be good to include here, but the shirt was a good second, third option for me.
Thank you. Acoma, what would you have, what's the next thing that you wanted on in the film?
Yeah, I was also thinking about this cash register and these hat blocks that were from the Harold Cotton hat shop from the 1950s. Harold Cotton was actually from Greensboro, North Carolina, and he was a small business owner. And he used the funds that came from his shop to kind of move up the economic ladder and promote welfare for the Black community within Greensboro. I absolutely love it. I've never seen hat blocks before, so it was really interesting. I didn't think about how hats were actually formed and molded, so it was pretty interesting. But at this register, you know, it really tells the story of how not just Black customers, but also white customers paid for these services, you know, to have their hats cleaned or their shoes shined, and how this actually sustained Cotton's family, as well as the larger African-American community within the surrounding Greensboro area. And I can only imagine, you know, kind of the dynamics, social, economic dynamics that were happening within the 50s in North Carolina, which, you know, might have been challenging for him. But, you know, I love this story because it focuses on small Black businesses that also sustained Black churches and schools and community institutions, right? And, you know, this really tells a story of an entrepreneur, no matter, you know, how small his business was, he found the capital to really put towards political and social movements.
You know, that's such a great story too, because on one level, when people talk about civil rights activism in Greensboro, which of course was a hotbed, people might talk about ministers and so on, but these everyday people sustained with great risk. They help people kind of go on the forefronts. And so something very modest, like a hat that blocker tells a wealth of stories. So I'm going to try to get one more question in, and I think I'm going to direct this to Crystal. So this is actually this is a very deep question from an anonymous attendee. Can you explore the reclamation of agency for Black Americans throughout the centuries via philanthropy and connect it to practices today?
Yeah, that is a very deep question that could be the subject of many conversations and books. But as I saw that question come in, I did begin thinking about it. And I think it relates to, you know, something that we've been trying to kind of put forth this entire program, is that thinking about Black philanthropy, as Acoma mentioned earlier, you know, was in some ways about resistance, in terms of resisting unequal racist structures and institutions, but also thinking about Black philanthropy and the causes and the issues and the themes that actually Black Americans prioritize, right? And so sometimes that connected to resisting white supremacy, other times that was connected to joy and celebration and love, and might not have had any connection, right, to white supremacist actions and inequality in this country. And so when we think about Black philanthropy centering Black people, both as givers and receivers, and knowing that cycle that it's a cyclical cycle, right? We can really think about what were the causes and what were the reasons behind traditions of Black giving, and really center and explore that. And so when I think about those ideas historically, I see that today, right? Thinking about what moves African Americans, what about the African American experience can we understand beyond centering it always in resistance to oppression? When we think about that and put Black folks at the center, we understand that there's so much more to the Black experience, and there's so much more that we can learn and understand about the Black experience with Black folks at the center.
This is a great message to kind of take us out on. I'm sure that many in the audience are saying, they didn't get to my question, and I apologize. You're experiencing some of the kind of really excitement of our discussions that we've been privileged to have over the summer about this topic. I really hope that you might be thinking a little bit differently about the objects that you might have in your own family connections. And when you hear people talk about, well, we You know, grandma used to bake cakes and sell them to people. As Sylvia's written about, this is often a form of philanthropy. So I'm really grateful to Amanda Moniz, Crystal Moten, Sylvia Marshall, and Acoma Gaither for this fantastic discussion, and for you for joining us today for this special program. Please consider completing the survey shared in the link in this chat. Your feedback really helps us. It helps us think that these are kind of programs that people are interested in and what you would like to see next. So you'll be seeing that link from our colleague. We also hope that you consider joining us in February for our next program about Black philanthropy. And I invite you to explore the work that we've been doing in exploring African-American business, Crystal Moten's exhibit, The Only One in the Room, social justice and philanthropy in exhibits including the Ipswich House, Giving in America, Who Pays for Education, and The Only One in the Room. And you'll be able to see those on the philanthropy website. And I see our great colleague Felicia Bell just dropped in about Georgia Gilmore, who sustained the Montgomery bus boycott through selling her baked goods. And it's a really lovely story there. So it's in the New York Times. So it helps you think differently. So thank you very much, Felicia. At the National Museum of American History, our mission is to empower people to create a just and compassionate future by exploring, preserving, and sharing the complexity of our past. We hope that by joining us today, you too have been able to learn and experience history that is meaningful and important. Thank you for sharing this hour with us today.